yours. Yeah. Yeah. It's not going to count for me. I can literally just drive myself around. Then what I can do, right? I can polish it. It's Frankie boy. Work here.
Rachel, can I ask whether you can hear us?
I can indeed, yes, thank you.
Precisely 7 o'clock. Good evening, everyone. I think you all probably know me. My name is Luciani Bauker. I'm from Democratic Services. Welcome to the Licensing and Appeals Committee tonight. And I'm going to start with the first item in the agenda, asking for nominations for chairman, please. And if you can put your mic on when you speak.
I'd like to nominate Beth Roland.
Do I have a seconder?
Yeah, second.
Are there any other nominations? Could I take a vote, please? All those in favor of Beth Roland? Yeah, it's one more than the abstainers. So Beth Roland, you've been elected. I don't know if you want to sit there, whether you want to move here, it's up to you.
See everyone from here.
Well, you need to put, yeah, okay, the mic is here, so it might be easier.
That's just so that you don't forget who I am.
That's it.
Thank you for that. And please, may I ask for nominations for vice chairman? Peter,
I'd like to nominate Sarah Kerr.
is there a seconder? No. Thank you. Any other nominations? Can we take a vote on that, please?
Duly elected.
Thank you. Are there any apologies for absence?
Yes, I have apologies for Mike Smith.
Any declarations of interest? No, thank you. And item 5, the minutes of the previous meeting, which you will find in the paperwork. Page 5. if we could look at it a page at a time, because there's quite a lot of words in these minutes. If we could go on page 5, page 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. Are you happy that those minutes are an accurate record of the meeting? Can you see a show of hands, please? Thank you. Thank you. Are there any matters arising from the minutes that don't come up in the agenda? No? Okay, thank you. We've no questions, as far as I'm aware, from members of the public. We could be finished in a few minutes. Are there any members' questions? No? Okay. Item 8, taxi and private hire draft policy review. I'd like to hand over to one of these beautiful gentlemen on my side. Ted, is it you?
Very kind of you to describe us in that way. Good evening, everybody. And just before introducing this paper, just to note that this is the first meeting of the Licensing and Appeals Committee since licensing functions were moved back to in-house provision at Wokingham Council from the 3-borough public protection partnership. So the last meeting was in March. So I'll just introduce our new licensing manager, Kieran Hinchliffe, who's sitting to my right. And he's been in post since the 1st of March, so was here during the handover from the Public Protection Partnership. And I'm pleased to say the handover from an operational point of view has gone smoothly, and licences, applications are being processed and issued. And Karen Court, who's our licensing officer, previously worked for the Public Protection Partnership, but wanted to come and join the new Wokingham service, partly because she was working on Wokingham licensing previously for the 3-borough partnership. So I'm lucky to have an excellent team on both sides of me, and hopefully you will find them excellent officers, and our ambition will be to provide the committee with the kind of service that you expect. The paper is the proposed revision to the taxi licensing policy, and the paper refers to the fact that the government produced new national standards for taxi licensing in 2020, and there was a report to this committee later that year setting out the changes needed. Work was commissioned to a firm of solicitors called James Button and Co. to draft a new taxi licensing policy, at the time, of course, under the 3-borough public protection partnership. And it is still our hope that the revised policy, once it's been considered by the 3 council's members and has gone out to public consultation, that the policy will be similar, if not the same, for the 3 boroughs, because, of course, taxi drivers and their customers cross borough borders, and to a certain extent, taxi and private hire drivers and operators can choose which council they licence with. Therefore, it's not desirable to have policies which markedly differ from council to council. How that will work out in practice rather remains to be seen once you have had a chance to comment on the paper, and the other 2 council's members have done likewise. I would just like to note that having had a further consultation with Rachel Lucas of Legal Services to amend one of the recommendations. So this is recommendation 2. We'd like to amend that recommendation to say, and delegate to the Director of Place and Growth, in consultation with the lead member of the executive, to release the final revised policy for public consultation. So, in short, to amend the recommendation that it should be the lead member on the executive who gives approval for public consultation rather than the executive as a whole. This we, since publishing the report, is in line with the Constitution, that the lead member on the executive can release items for public consultation. And it means that the timescale can be more easily coordinated with the other two boroughs, because we would not be so beholden to the meeting schedule timescales for executive. So that with that proposed amendment, I would, unless you want to comment or question that straight away, I'd like to just ask Kieran to just briefly outline the new policy and how it differs from the old policy.
Chris?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You mentioned the other two boroughs. You presumably mean the other two that were in the PPP or still are in the PPP. Why those two particularly?
Can you turn your mic off, Chris, please?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, it will be. I do mean West Berkshire Council and Bracknell Forest Council. To answer your question, in simple terms, as a matter of expediency, because those three boroughs have jointly commissioned the drafting of the new policy, therefore are already working along similar lines. It needs to be stated we have the very big borough of Reading sort of sitting alongside, and we also have Windsor and Maidenhead, which does have a large Hackney carriage and private licensed vehicle trade. I think for expediency, it would be very difficult to have a combined policy with all five boroughs or indeed any other boroughs. But as a matter of principle, it would be good practice to achieve some consistency, at least with two neighbouring boroughs, albeit not with all our neighbouring boroughs.
Bill?
Yeah, is it planned that the executive members of each borough will meet on a regular basis to discuss these terms?
We could take that as a suggestion. I'm not aware that that is yet proposed, but we could take that as a suggestion.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments?
Thank you.
Kieran, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Kieran Hinchliffe. I'm your new service manager for licensing. Over the coming years, if you have any issues with premises licenses, gambling licenses, taxi licenses, then by all means, drop me an email. And I also manage the customer delivery to the enforcement and safety service. So again, from a customer service perspective, if there are any issues or queries that you had for the enforcement and safety service, then by all means, please drop me a line. My email address should be within the pack. So for this evening, it's slightly interesting to be presenting a report to you for a policy. Generally, what happens is from a local government officer is you live and breathe the policy, and you work with members and lawyers and trade liaison throughout the policy, and that's built in terms of a draft. So I do come in at a slightly unusual position, and the position is that this piece of work has been commissioned to a leading licensing lawyer, and that's what's been produced to Wokingham Borough Council. So the concept of this meeting is to present the draft format to you and to invite any suggestions or debate to be had or queries in between now and July. So that we can get that feedback in. Effectively, you're being handed, which is a public document, a public-facing document, you're being handed the first draft. Once we've completed that process, the plan will be to release this to a public consultation, which will include the trade themselves and members of the public and any other lobbying organisations. The plan at that point as well, although these elements are not set in stone, the plan would be to have trade liaison groups, because obviously the measures that are being brought forward, they are regulatory measures that impact on business. So what we will need to have through the consultation is that impact on our licensed trade. So to get into a summary of the report, the DFT recommends licensing authorities make publicly available a cohesive policy document that brings together all their procedures on taxi and private hire vehicle licensing, and it should include but not be limited on policies on convictions and fit and proper person test. In 2020, the DFT issued statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards. Wokingham Borough Council had met some of these standards, but it stretches us slightly further into adopting more of a stringent approach. This is an attempt to effectively nationalise vehicle and driver and operator conditions. As mentioned in my opening, the draft policy was commissioned in collaboration with the PPP, with West Berkshire and Bracknell Forest councils, and the Licensing and Appeals Committee is invited to comment on this draft policy. In terms of analysis of the issues, at page 16 of your report, it contains the principal changes contained within those DFT 2020 standards. It covers their A to K. The fit and proper person test. There is no statutory definition of this to what amounts a fit and proper person for the purposes of the legislation, but there is now much more robust guidance in the new standards. From administration, there should be sufficient training and adequate resource for all those involved with making decisions, and any functions that are deregulated should be set out in a clear scheme of delegation. And whilst less contentious matters can be resolved by authorised officers, it is recommended that more serious issues and more serious matters are dealt with by way of committee. Whistleblowing, it's recommended that authorities have effective internal procedures for staff to raise concerns and procedures in place for any concerns to be dealt with openly and fairly. The Dbs Checks is a new proposal. We obviously have Dbs certificate checks at the moment. They're at an enhanced level. This stretches it to an update service. So we are briefing our trade at the moment with the fact that this update service is likely to be introduced at a policy level. So when a DBS certificate is applied for, which is now applied for online, they are encouraged to sign up to a subscription as a subscription base. And what the subscription allows the local authority to do, it allows the local authority to actually run a report and see if there's been any changes on those DBS certificates. So effectively, it's a stronger, more robust regulatory measure, whereas we're not waiting to be informed by the submission of a DBS certificate or informed by another agency via our LADO function or via the police contact or even from the taxi driver themselves. We can run checks and see if there's been any update to their convictions. Overseas convictions, certificates of good character should be obtained where an applicant has previously lived outside the UK for more than 3 months. Convictions policies, all authorities will have a clear policy that takes a particularly cautious view of any offences against individuals with special needs, children or other vulnerable groups, particularly those involving violence, those of a sexual nature and those linked to organised crime. And complaints against licensees, all authorities should have a robust complaint recording system to take action if necessary. Mandatory safeguarding awareness training for all drivers, and training should include county lines drug trafficking awareness. We do have that in our policy at this moment in time, but we'll be looking in the future to see if we can bring those functions in-house and have it more bespoke to Wokingham Borough Council. Literacy and numeracy, all licence holders to demonstrate proficiency in English language. Drivers should be able to provide the correct change and produce a legible written receipt upon request. For enforcement, suspension and revocation of driver licences, the guidance clarifies situations where revocations and suspensions may be used, and drivers should be made aware of the relevant policies. And then it goes on consultation, which of course would happen naturally for any sort of policy. Suggests good practice to consult when proposing significant changes with the local licensing rules, and consultation should include passenger and trade groups, which is absolutely what we would aim to achieve through that consultation. Thank you, members. That's just a summary of the changes for the new draft policy.
Thank you, Kieran.
Sorry.
Just to say, Chair, in Appendix B of the report is a summary of the contents of the policy. I'm very conscious that the document you've been given is 96 pages long, although the last 30 or 40 pages are the conditions, which are appendices, if you like, but it's still a long document. So we've summarised what the contents of the document are. And I also want to just apologise to members that the formatting of the draft policy is not good. We are aware of that. We spent a lot of time getting the formatting to the state that it's in now before it was time to publish the report on the policy. I think effectively we've got to copy all of the text into a fresh document and reformat the whole document. This is the form in which we received it from the Commission's legal advisors. So with that noted, I'll hand back to the Chair for any questions.
Thank you, Ed. Yes, any questions from members? Sarah, Rachel, and then Michael.
Thank you, and welcome to the council. And firstly, just that bit on Appendix B, actually it's really useful. I just remember when we had the gambling policy come through and going through that in fine detail, actually having this summary is really helpful because not all of us, have a legal background. I have a few questions. So firstly, I understand that licensees must comply with their duties under the relevant parts of the Equalities Act 2010. My question around that is how are we helping licensees to understand what are the relevant parts? Should I ask all my questions in one go or do them one at a time?
One go, please. Answer.
Yes, you want to answer that first? Okay, thanks. So all in one go, did you say?
Yeah,
Sorry. Okay, so there's that question. I wanted to ask about this, a good knowledge of Woking and Borough and the surrounding areas. They will be required to pass a test on this knowledge prior to a licence being issued. This test must be passed again every 6 years. So I've got a couple of questions around that. Is there a cost associated with them doing this test? And I understand the initial idea of doing the test, but once someone's been doing this for 6 years, I think one could assume that their knowledge of the area is pretty good. And if I don't know if they're having to pay for this or not, but to then ask them to do that again when their knowledge will probably improve just by doing the job, I didn't quite understand why they need to be doing that every 6 years. I think there's an error on the document. On page 8 of the policy, which is page 30 of our pack, it says acceptable courses are currently provided by the following providers. And then there's no following providers listed. Page 18 of the policy, page 40 of our pack, I wanted to understand why is advertising restricted in this way. I didn't understand the reason behind that. So I've got quite a few questions here. Appeals, I don't understand why it goes directly to court. With other licences, we have an internal appeals process, and I don't understand why we don't use that. There's obviously a legal reason, but I'd like to understand that. The consultation I want to ask about, so there is, and this might be something that Rachel might cover more in her question, but there's obviously, we've had issues in the past with consultation with the Taxi Liaison Forum, where consultation has actually closed prior to the meeting. I believe that was the case. And they've also looked in the past at number of comments back from the drivers, and they usually bring a united voice, which should hold more strength. So I want to ask around that, and I'm sure Rachel will pick up on that further. And then the other thing, this is it was a real bugbear of mine. It says at the start of it says under the climate bit, a thriving taxi trade will contribute to carbon neutral objectives by assisting to reduce reliance on personal vehicle transport. How on earth has that been ascertained, please? Because when I spoke with the climate officers today, they didn't agree. Thank you.
So I suppose reverse order, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The carbon neutral, I think that covers right at the end with the climate emergency. We're not stepping into the policy consultation at this moment in time, but clearly with the section on climate emergency, due consideration will be given when we reach the point of going for a full public consultation. I'm not an expert in that area. There are some measures that are detailed within the policy that also go a step further. They talk about the Euro emission standards and etc. for vehicle standards. So it's not left as a simple line. So when it comes to a point of a consultation, we should see a bit more of a stretch in terms of what's required under the climate emergency.
I think I'd be interested to know the feedback you got. I mean, it is an assumption, it's not empirical, but the assumption is if we want to reduce reliance on private car ownership, the availability of more hired vehicles or taxi vehicles would encourage less people to own a car. If you have no taxis, people may have to purchase their own vehicle. That may be an assumption, may not, and if there's an alternative view, I'm very interested in it.
Come back on that quickly.
Yeah.
That is a huge assumption, and in an area where you've got large amounts of public transport links as well, maybe. But that it was quite a bold statement, and as you said, it's an assumption. I think that needs looking at for the area that we're in.
So, yeah, you've got the other points.
I do. Thank you, Councillor. I mean, this is ultimately your area with these wider policies. I
think the consultation, including the meeting, you know, I think that's just a point about making sure that
the
dates are sensible in terms of consultation and meetings. The appeals process, I can't recall which type of appeal it was. Do you know, or is that something we should take away and answer? You said appeals process to court. Is this an appeal against, do you know what it was? An appeal against, it's on.
So it said in the paper that if anyone wants to appeal, if they've not received their licence or revoked or something in the appeal, it goes to the magistrate courts first and the Crown Court, I believe. It was a very long document. I believe that's what it said. And I'm just a bit confused because when there are licensing issues, we obviously have licensing sub-appeal here, and I don't understand why we don't use that for appeals on these licenses.
Maybe that's something we'll look into. Yeah.
Could we bring that back to the
Bring it back, yeah, as part of the feedback. We're asking for feedback by the 31st of July. We're obviously starting that process today, so we get that. The advertising restrictions, do you as to why we restrict advertising?
Vehicles.
I think actually what's in the proposed consultation is actually extending what is currently allowed. It does say that there can be wraparound advertising on vehicles.
I must have missed that because it looked different. I will look that up while we're going through the rest of the meeting and come back at the end if that's the case.
Yeah, and I would suggest the consideration is does the members of the council want there to be advertising on taxi vehicles or no advertising? You can argue it either way.
So, I mean, the reason why I was querying that is it potentially another source of income for the cab drivers? And obviously they've been very financially hit and they've got the added problem of fuel increase. Is it a way we could be helping them out? That was my thinking around that.
Potentially more flexibility around advertising. I mean, some of the advertising is whole vehicle advertising, isn't it? It's a wrap on the whole vehicle, so the whole vehicle becomes an advert, doesn't it? For, well, I won't mention a brand name, but you know where I'm going with it. They contract with the brand name to wrap the whole vehicle, and that may or may not fit with how members see the corporate image of the trade. And the first point was, yes, the list of providers, yes, with that needs to be populated, who the providers are. And the knowledge test, yes, I think that was a good point to take away. Did anybody have any comments on, if you pass the knowledge test once and then you drive for 6 years, you'd be surprising if you didn't know your way around, wouldn't it? So I think we'll take that away as a point made.
Thank you.
It was the one other, it was about the equality, their duty under the Equalities Act and what we're doing to help them to understand what their duties are.
Provider training. Do my colleagues have a view on that? I mean, obviously the whole issue about access to the vehicle for people with a disability is a key part of the vehicle standards for hackney carriages. But of course, that's only one part of the protected characteristics in the Equalities Act. And part of the reasoning for the standards was violence against women and girls or other people with vulnerability. So I think that's a point well made about what information is there for drivers about what that requirement to be compliant with the Equality Act is about, because the last thing you'd want is it to be just a kind of tick box. Yes, of course, we comply with the Equalities Act. We actually want them to understand what that means about the Equality Act, which from memory prohibits providing a service in a way which discriminates against anybody who has one of the protected characteristics or more than one.
Yeah, I can take your eye, councillor, to it's page 32 of the report and page 10 of this draft policy. It covers some of the training and assistance of disabled persons. It also goes on to training of safeguarding and child sexual abuse and exploitation. I think the recommendation in the draft policy is that refresher training on in that area is required every 3 years.
Could I just follow that on, being a disabled person who uses a scooter? Will we have some taxis that will be able to take disability scooters?
It's quite a complicated question, councillor, because I think we do have wheelchair accessible vehicles. There are larger vehicles that can take non-standard wheelchairs and etc. But these are infrequent models. They're often a lot older, and it's effectively an issue with the availability for the trade themselves in terms of that. I think the policy does touch on this slightly, where it discusses the introduction of age of vehicles, whereas some of the wheelchair accessible vehicles may not be as demanding in terms of the age requirements that have been put on to effectively assist that area. It's a complicated. There's clearly a best case scenario, but there's also just real hard practical issues in terms of having a complete fleet that's accessible in that way.
Thank you. Sarah, is that your questions answered? Rachel?
Yes, it is now. Thank you. Yeah, just to come back on the consultation, I'd just like to know a bit more about how you plan to do that, because it's obviously really, it's a lot in here, and it's really important we get it right now as much as we can to avoid years of, unnecessary dissatisfaction from the trade particularly. So, and we have had, a few years ago now, but we have had examples where the consultations have not been particularly widespread, and, it'd be good to have a bit more detail about how you plan to make sure that's really a meaningful consultation. And then a couple of other points. A lot of this, quite rightly, is about passenger safety and public safety, and no one's going to disagree with the importance of that. But just a couple of things from a driver point of view. On inspections, so the wording on this is quite a lot clearer than it was before. I think the wording of the current policy caused quite a lot of confusion. This is obviously very different to that. But how has that sort of come about? And how will those inspections be carried out? So in the current policy, there's mention of like an RAC inspection that drivers have to pay for themselves. Will they have to pay for in the new regime? How will it work? And how will that sort of affect the cost for drivers? And then secondly, another area that's come up a lot is the dimensions and the height of vehicles, which we've already touched on slightly. So obviously this is in relation to wheelchair access. So again, there's various size requirements within here. So I'd like to know how you've come up with those requirements, where have those numbers come from? Because I know we've had a lot of sort of toing and froing about that in the past. So how have you come up with those, and how different will they be overall from a driver perspective? How sort of controversial essentially will they be from a driver perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. So just to cover your question over consultation, I think the most straightforward way to answer that question is to give you the answer in terms of the full detail. What I would propose is to come back with dates, because one of the aims of this consultation is to work with the other local authorities. So we need to assess where they're up to with their own consultations. What my boss brought in was effectively a recommendation to enable us to work a better policy, a better consultation, and to have that flexibility to go to consultation at set points. So please consider that recommendation. What we'd like to provide you with is effectively those dates, those set dates where we're unified between the number of councils, and what we would propose are those perhaps the need for face-to-face meetings with members of the trade. Perhaps it might be the case that they form a unified trade lobby, but effectively an open invitation, which we would take part in as officers, but we would hope elected members share that same forum, because it's your policy that's been set.
Inspections and dimensions, Karen.
Thank you, Ed. Yes, to address that issue, I think the RAC inspections that you're thinking about are the ones where the vehicle had reached a certain age and then wanted to go beyond. So that required an RAC inspection. As you know, those are currently suspended until September this year. From the point of view of bringing on a new vehicle, we're looking at the documentation and does it meet the policy criteria. So we're in effect checking all that documentation to make sure. So if someone wants to bring on a new vehicle, we're making sure it meets all those requirements before any new wheelchair accessible vehicle is actually brought on the fleet. The dimensions proposed in the new policy, they're based, I believe, they've come from James Button, the lawyer. They're based, I believe, on the Transport for London dimensions. I don't know. Does anyone want to comment on that? I believe that's where they come from. They are actually they're slightly more generous than the dimensions that we currently have in the policy. So they have both been reduced slightly.
You say generous, you mean to the drivers?
To the drivers, yes. Yeah.
Just to preempt the question about transition arrangements, I mean, if there is any, it sounds as if the dimensions are actually being relaxed towards being smaller, if you get my drift. But if there was any change which was meaning that currently used vehicles can no longer meet the terms of the policy, we would have to think about some kind of transition arrangement, so that vehicles don't become non-compliant on the date that the new policy comes in. That's just something we would look into, unless it's the case that the current dimensions are smaller than the old dimensions.
Just come back on the inspection side. So what about for old, you've talked about new vehicles, what about for older vehicles? Obviously the 10-year thing's gone, and it's sort of more simple and straightforward now, but what's the inspection regime for older vehicles, and how does that work?
The vehicles are required to have regular, so they would have, when they're first licensed, they would have an MOT test and a full, what we call the private hire Hackney carriage, so they get the garage test to check compliance. That's done at 6 months, and then as the vehicle ages, it would then be required every 4 months under the new policy.
Okay, and that would be at the cost to the driver?
Yes, it would, yes.
I did have a few sort of minor typos and stuff, so should I just email those through to Kieran? Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chairman. Congratulations on your election. Yeah, I've actually got just a couple comments and one question actually. About on page 16 of the agenda about the fit and proper test. Bit of a tongue twister, that one. About more robust guidance. I think it's going to make everybody's job a lot easier to actually have more robust guidance rather than just try to make a very subjective opinion on someone, which you might be biased in some way or prejudiced, you don't know, or for all sorts of reasons. So that will certainly help. And on page 29, it says when about evidence of who you are. It makes, it's just on the third line down, it says EC passport. Surely that should be EU passport. EC has not existed for 10 years, could be even more than that. Okay, and I know Councillor Kerr mentioned this earlier on about the knowledge test. And I just really want to find out what standard is this test and what is the pass mark? Is it very difficult, very hard or low, or anyone could probably pass it? It'd be interesting to find out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, towards the question about the knowledge test, it's there's a list of various locations and roads within the Wokingham Borough, and the driver will be asked to describe, if he was picking up from a shoot end, how he would arrive at any number. I think it's we base it on 10 questions, how to describe the routes. Obviously it requires an officer sitting with him to have local knowledge, but to ensure that he describes the route, takes the most prudent route and the most efficient route to that place, and then the pass mark is 9 out of 10.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a pretty hard test, which is what we would expect.
It's fairly robust, but
yeah.
it would take maybe a range. So it might be a how to get to a particular pub or a hospital so there's a range of different premises that they would be asked and expected to know, and they can revise for that beforehand, so it's not totally out of the blue. They are able to revise in advance for that.
Yeah, revision makes sense because it's going to build up their knowledge anyhow, and I think I kind of agree with Councillor Kerr about retaking it every 6 years. You're going to build this knowledge up after time about doing all the drops and whatever and driving around. You're going to find out, and you've probably got a lot of knowledge already if you're local. And I'm glad you were saying that officers will have local knowledge as well, because that's obviously crucial to the getting the answers that we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points actually have been made already, but just maybe further explanation of that, and maybe one comment at the end. Consultation, which was highlighted earlier on, I think it's the details of the I'm just thinking, obviously some people come from outside the borough. It could be Reading, could be Slough, could be all around Berkshire. How will they be? And they actually run their taxis here. So how far will the consultation go, right? Is it just the people who are the taxi drivers at the moment now, or will it go much, much wider? Because obviously we need to make sure that all the stakeholders are engaged and their views have been taken. So how far and wide our consultation will be, and obviously what form it's going to take as well. That's not something which I'm clear about at the moment. I've got a couple of others as well. Should I just take one by one, or?
Right. To say them all.
Yeah, okay. The adverts, right? I think I agree with Sarah that I'd rather go with the something which benefits the drivers. They've been through difficult times the last couple of years. If they can have certain income to the adverts, then the question I have is there anything in the registration which will stop us giving them go ahead? And say, look, yes, you can within certain guidelines, or what type of adverts they can have, right? Is there something stopping us, or which to giving them the go ahead to do that, or not? I don't know. This is one thing, just a question, a clarification, perhaps. So that's the second one. Third one, literacy and numeracy test, right? Is it a proper? I assume it's a test. Is that a certain? Something they have to sit, or is it just verbal? Is it written? How many marks they have to get to actually get through that. The tests, same as the other, question which was highlighted earlier on as well. I mean, again, just a comment on DBS, right? And I understand that obviously, but DBS, and just a comment, the DBS is a predictor, right? This always looks in the past, right? It doesn't look in the future. So somebody has committed a certain act, or has it appear in the record, therefore they will be flagged up. But it doesn't mean that actually they might not, something might happen in the future. So I'm just thinking, I don't have an answer to that, but I'm not, as officers, perhaps you're the expertise, do you look much wider than just the DBS to make sure that the person is fit and proper?
Councillor, just to come back on the last question with order there. I agree that the DBS looks at past history because something needs to happen in the past for it to then go on to the DBS. The change that's being proposed is that the DBS is going to be an update service. So that's the change. So we currently have the enhanced DBS certificate, which is checked. The proposal is to have all drivers sign up to the update service. And what that means is that if there is then a conviction during that period of them being licensed that flags up on the DBS certificate, then the local authority is made aware quicker. So there are other routes to understanding if a conviction has happened. We could be notified through the local authority designated officer. We could be notified by our police colleagues. We could be tipped off by a member of the public, or we could be alerted by another driver. But if it was ever to be failed that the driver did not disclose that they've had a conviction, realistically, if none of those avenues were fulfilled, then as a local authority, we would only actually know it once we've run that DBS certificate, which could take potentially 3 years. So the update service means that we can run it more routinely and we can be a little bit more assured. So that's certainly a good step forward, despite the it not being a perfect scenario. And we do look wider. Some of the overall fit and proper assessment, they cover the practical assessments for licensed drivers, medical examinations, and then we step into the spoken and written English. I suppose I'll just cover the literacy and numeracy because I've got the page open on that as well. So you asked about what was involved. What's been detailed in this policy draft, it's on page 31 of the report, and it's number 9 in the draft, and it talks about it talks about how spoken and written English is essential for public safety, that all licensed drivers are able to communicate, and it's put down here that the level is B1, which is on the Common European Framework of Reference for Reading, Writing, Speaking and Listening. I believe level B1 is the standard for citizenship. It's a relatively low level, but it is the threshold to meet citizenship, and it would meet the threshold of being able to communicate in the way that's being asked of the drivers. So from a public safety perspective, this measure is only put in for the benefit of public safety. It's not been put in as an alternative measure, as a barrier to entry, other than for the public safety. And then it talks about the speaking and listening assessment itself, and there's an assessment that can be undertaken by the secure video telephone link, and that's through a service provider called PeopleCert. I believe that the proposal that's been put forward in this policy is what's been agreed through the other councils in terms of how they would make that assessment. So it appears to be a £36 assessment or £16 for a reset. That's currently what they've put forward for the speaking and listening assessment, and the reading and writing assessment, which is the SERU assessment.
So advertising and consultation. Happy to speak about advertising. Would we limit advertising?
I think it's a good question. I think we would need to look at some parameters to see what would and would not be appropriate. It'd obviously be more helpful to perhaps set some parameters than to assess on an individual case basis, because as we can imagine, you know, there are some that might not be appropriate. So I think we would have to take that into consideration and perhaps come up with some proposals on the types of advert that might or might not be appropriate.
Sorry, Chair, could I just, because this, I hope you don't mind me jumping in, because this is something I raised earlier and I found the bit in here now. And the problem is in the policy, it's actually confusing what's written. I think that was the problem, to refresh myself. So it actually says advertising on the outside of any licensed vehicle is restricted to the name and telephone number of the owner or operator of the hackney carriage private hire vehicle, and there's some parameters. But it then says, in addition, wheelchair accessible hackney carriages and private hire vehicles may carry all over wrap and all of this. And it's a very confusing set of wording in there. Something needs to be clarified around that. And I think generally we should be looking in presumption of, yes, it's fine, but here are some restrictions maybe, rather than no, but here are some circumstances where you can. So change the onus, if that makes sense. I don't know how everyone else feels, but that would make more sense to me. So I didn't want to jump in on your point, Shahid, but similar point to earlier.
So I think you're pretty right. I have the same view as well. I will give them the go ahead and put them some guidelines. This is what they can advertise, and this is some they can't advertise. There should be clearly some limits. But yes, but with guidelines, rather than saying no, you can't do it, or make it, because I think, why shouldn't we? Why would council restrict it? What is the reason? That's what we're trying to understand. Is there any guidelines or legislation, perhaps which I'm aware of, which stops them, going that particular route? If it isn't, then I would say yes, go ahead. But these are the guidelines to do it.
Yes, an interesting discussion, giving us lots of things to think about. I would suggest there's probably a choice between saying the advertising is allowed provided it meets national regulations. So I think that means that cigarette advertising is out, possibly one or two other things. If we wanted to go further and say in this borough we prefer that this type of thing is not advertised, like online gambling site, for example, that will be a local decision, but could obviously take us into some quite complicated waters about whether it's legitimate for a local authority to do that if it's permitted by national guidelines. But interesting points made.
Sorry, can I just, Chair, I suppose when you're consulting other boroughs as well, it'd be useful to have that discussion with the other boroughs. So the discussion is across borough rather than just Woking Pacific.
Yes, indeed.
And then obviously because vehicles are going from one borough to the other and they're coming from here as well. So it doesn't, it doesn't make sense, right? That, so I think when those guidelines are set up, then I think it'll be best to consult other boroughs, especially in kind of Berkshire, where most likely they're going to have a business. So there is a unanimity and across all councils.
Yes, your first point was the width of the consultation. We obviously have direct contacts with current licensees in our borough. I see no reason why we shouldn't ask neighbouring boroughs to forward details of our consultation to their licensed drivers, and of course social media will go as far as it goes. These days, sort of physically promoted consultation doesn't really happen, does it? It's more done electronically, or we could do it via our neighbouring boroughs to notify their licensees.
I think there's assumption that social media, if you put something on the social media, then everybody's going to listen, look into it. I'm not sure that assumption is correct. It depends certain clientele, certain people who are actually very good social media, they will look at it. Other people probably And I'm not sure taxi drivers may or may not come on the category. So just putting on social media and assuming they'll get the message, I wouldn't make that assumption. This is my personal view. But obviously, the quickest way when speaking to the taxi drivers is if you mention something to the people who are, the organizations they have their own WhatsApp groups and they have their own channels. I think that's the best way to get the information across, and not only across the borough, but actually across all boroughs as well, as it just spreads like a wildfire. That does.
I just want to pick it up a little bit further, and the assumption there that, consultations are all done online now and it's the way, that wouldn't really sit with our public sector equality duty. Not all of our residents are digital. This is obviously about the taxi trade, and it's about people that use taxi services as well, and a lot of them will not be online. And we need to be Equalities Act compliant, and just doing it online is not enough.
No, the point is well made.
Bill,
Yeah.
was it on that point?
Yes, yeah. As far as consultation is concerned, a number of the hearings that we've had a representative, a spokesperson for a taxi group, particularly in Twyford. Is that the case, that there is one person who may be a spokesman that you could go to consult with, so that message then would be passed on? I don't know whether if that is a common thing amongst the taxi groups, that there is one representative.
It was the case, and certainly, as you know, we've had communication with the Woking Taxi Association, and there were drivers up at Twyford as well. I think probably we would aim to get the consultation out to all of our drivers.
Thank you, Chair. It's more of observation. I think one of the reasons we got in-house here is to benefit our needs of Wokingham Borough resident and our taxi drivers. As you mentioned, James Button and Co. solicitors are doing a formal one policy for all the boroughs, which I feel difficult to take on, because our needs are different than West Berkshire or Reading, for example. The demographics and how things are working on those sides. So I know it is draft. We can come back hopefully to amend or change. And my other question, it's not a question, is also on page 16 on letter H, mandatory safeguarding awareness training for all drivers. Training should include country lines, drugs, traffic and awareness. Is this done by Thames Valley Police, or is it within our officers here who will be doing that? And how you intend to take this on board?
Councillor, there's currently several providers that provide that training for cost. For example, the Blue Lamp service. There is ambition to look at that training that's being provided, to see if there's an option to bring that training in house as well. But there are providers. It's not through Thames Valley Police. It's through an actual organisation that do it as an online and e-learning for, I think it's around £40.
Did you mention £40? 40, yeah. All right. It's not about the money what I'm more afraid. It's about, I know a lot of immigration enforcement things came into these policies, which is in a way is good and robust, but we also know that we have a lot of people from overseas, such as Hong Kong, Syria and Ukraine. I'm just hoping these guys can drive perfectly well, but not able to speak perfectly well English. There is no room for them, to be honest, to engage in this industry. It looks quite tough for them at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got 4 questions. Page 19, going down to Appendix B. Point 3, quite rightly suggests that taxi drivers should give a good period of time before the expiry of their driving licence before renewing it. which puts quite a bit of onus on them. But of course, it also depends how long it takes the council to process it. In addition, though, if the renewal were refused and there were an appeal, is it not reasonable that there should be enough time both to process and to hear the appeal before the expiry? Which is very, and that is very much the onus there, I think, is on the council to get through it. So would a sensible time, could that be suggested as a reasonable time before the expiry in which they need to submit, rather than just saying it's up to them? Because in the case of an appeal, they wouldn't really know. And if there is an appeal, and the appeal was not heard until after the expiry of the licence, could they, during the period when the appeal was being heard, could they continue driving as a taxi driver? Do you want to do the others as well?
Can I just make a very similar point to add on that? Because I noticed the same thing. And I think elsewhere on page 35 of our pack, it says 30 days. So in one place it says insufficient time. And another place it says 30 days. So I think it's a valid question, which is to point there's slight inconsistency there as well.
Did you want me to ask?
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, cracking points. Make a licensing officer out of yourself there, I think. It is quite interesting how you thought about it in that depth. I believe that we should involve our legal services to give you an adequate comment back as part of this draft exercise. But I think I could probably jump ahead slightly and say that there are effectively perhaps two areas, two sections that can be used in terms of determining an application, and one in terms of what you're alluding to with the right of appeal to the court and how they sit at that point in time, whether they can continue or not. And then the other side of things is if something has occurred at a point where they're renewing their license, but what's been alleged is something very, very serious. So there are abilities to revoke a license, even if it is at the point of renewal, and for the authority to actually take a much stronger and robust stance where the revocation is immediate or the suspension is immediate, and that effectively takes place straight away, and they then have the appeal to the magistrates court. For the process which you're mainly describing, where there may be some issues which are serious enough to be considered, but not effectively like a gross misconduct, sexual assault type offence, then you're quite right to point out that we do need to look at the adequate time. It may be the case that the 30 days is adequate time, but I'll certainly take that back with our legal services and map that out so we are clear, and particularly with the view that your licensing team needs to be able to function to that level too.
Please, can I stop you and bring Rachel?
Sorry, Rachel.
Yes, good evening. So I'm Rachel Lucas. I'm legal advisor here tonight. And actually, I was listening to the question and thought I may have quite a bit to add, but Kieran knows so much about this. I've probably got far less to add than I thought. I think I'll say the first thing I'll say is once an appeal gets in the hands of the magistrates court, it needs to be effectively listed as a full trial, and sadly the court's very pressed at the moment and don't consider taxi appeals to be as high priority as, for example, custody matters or domestic violence matters. So we do tend to get put off and adjourned if the courts are under pressure. Even if the courts hear them on the first occasion they're listed, we're usually talking about 4 months from the first hearing. So I don't think that there would be a reasonable time to reapply and to allow an appeal to the magistrates court to be heard. That would very much be on a case-by-case basis. As Kieran said, ordinarily, pending an appeal, drivers can carry on driving. It is in rare circumstances, if they are revoked or not renewed for the purposes of public safety, that takes place instantly and they can't carry on driving. And I have had cases where drivers have asked for that to be stopped effectively or suspended on an interim basis pending appeal, and then the court will make a determination on that, and they'll make that determination quite quickly. But I don't think in reality we can ask people to renew to give them time to go to the magistrates court, because it would effectively, you know, you could be talking about a year in total, and it's just not reasonable. But hopefully we won't be revoking too many people or refusing to renew them. I don't know if I can assist any further in relation to that, but I hope it clarifies the situation a little.
So I'm slightly confused. I thought there was an appeal to a subcommittee.
Well, that was raised earlier, and I think that is something that has to be clarified first, because at the moment, the policy as drafted, as has been pointed out tonight, appears to get rid of that altogether in certain circumstances, and I'm a little confused about that, I have to confess. And that is something that you will look at hopefully before this goes out for public consultation, because not meaning to second guess the rationale for that, I can't see a legal rationale for the subcommittee stage to be skipped. It may be that that my colleagues in licensing can, but from my perspective, it does seem slightly nonsensical when we have the ability, and as an authority, we have been doing this in the past, to hear these internally first. And from the perspective of the driver, it gives them effectively another bite of the cherry, whilst allowing elected representatives the opportunity to give their views on it. So my view is it's a win-win, and I can't see a legal problem with it. But it may be that this was drafted with something else in mind, and it may be that's something that you as members of this committee want to put forward before this goes out for public consultation. I don't know if Kieran or Ed have anything to add in relation to that. It strikes me as odd, but it's a possible way of doing it.
We have done appeals in the past. Chris and I have done some together, and it is a way of speeding things up, especially if it's not a terribly serious, and I'll say crime in inverted commas. And this was drafted by a third party who probably had no knowledge of that. So can we have it adjusted that we can do internal appeals?
Yeah, I'd like to say that.
Everyone happy with that?
Also, Chair, is that obviously if they go to the, I assume if you go to the court, there'll be a cost associated with that as well. So unnecessarily, the drivers, have to pay for that when actually the local committee may actually be able to decision. So unnecessarily, we're putting them through the journey when there isn't a need to.
Can we just take a straw?
Yes, paragraphs 13 and 14, unless I'm misreading it, are not mutually exclusive. If your car is 5 years, less than 5 years old and done more than 25,000 miles, then it satisfies both 13 and 14. I think all that needs to be done is to change all to and in the top line of page 21.
The age of the vehicle.
Yes. Both the criteria can be satisfied at the same time. Which can't be right. 16 refers to a specification. I don't know what specification it's referring to. Paragraph 16. And I only had one more point, so shall I mention that now? It was on page 30. It was really about medical conditions. There's no direct link between the GP and the council on a driver's state of health. He would have to, if he were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is mentioned in the policy, unless he divulged it, we wouldn't know. Is there anything could be done about that?
Sorry, if you've got type 1 diabetes, you have to have your licenses taken away straight away and reviewed by your doctor.
Your normal driving licence?
Yes.
Okay. So are there any medical conditions where that is not necessary, but you would have to have your Hackney driver through taxi licence taken away from you? I think it only mentioned diabetes and epilepsy. No, epilepsy is no good.
It does remain with the doctor's assessment on medicals. We effectively don't take a view as licensing officers because we're not medically trained. So it's from that report, the Group 2 medical standards, whether or not they're fit to drive or not.
No, the point was you wouldn't necessarily know unless the taxi driver told you.
No, but
if he didn't have his driving licence revoked.
Yeah, once you're diagnosed with something like type 1 diabetes, your doctor tells you you have a duty to declare it to the DVLA.
Yes, my point was the circumstances where you wouldn't have to do that, but the council would need to know for the purposes of the taxi driver's licence, which is a different licence, of course.
Mm.
I think what my colleagues are whispering to me is that the report should be from the person's own GP. So it's up to the GP to tell us what they think is relevant in regard to their medical conditions and ability to drive. It's not for the taxi drivers to tell us what conditions they've got. It's in the GP's report.
It's great. How do you get the information? If the taxi driver doesn't want to tell you, you won't get it because the GP won't tell you because patient confidentiality, surely. Do you see what I mean?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, if I may come in on that. Yeah, that's why we say that the applicant goes to their own GP, because that GP then has access to their medical records. So if there's a condition, it would be on their medical records.
But will they tell us? GP tell us?
Yeah, the GP, the Group 2 medical will go through their any medical issues and highlight anything.
There's no link between if the taxi driver doesn't say anything, won't know. If he's retained his DVLA licence. Sorry, I want to labour the point.
I was going to say, can I ask the question in a slightly different way? So this is about when they actually go and have medicals. If they get diagnosed with something when a medical isn't required, that's the issue I think Chris is making, unless I've got that wrong. Yeah, so they obviously, if they're going to get a medical at the time that they're required to get a medical according to this, then fine. But if they get diagnosed with something like that at a time they're not due a medical, how then do you know?
I believe if it's not already in there, there'll be a condition of a licence to inform the licensing authority if there's any change in medical status. So it would be by way of a licence condition. Again, this won't stretch as far as the similar example as what we have with the DBS certificates. The regulation can only go so far because we don't have real-time medical checks or indeed real-time DBS certificate checks. There is improvements in the DBS area with the update service. You could consider the scope of how often medicals are carried out, but ultimately you've spotted an area which is, I wouldn't say weak, but I don't think there is an alternative, an at all alternative.
Yeah, just on that.
Just on that particular point, I think what I understand from Chris as well, and because of the GDPR, GPs cannot devolve the information. So this is the point which is being made, right?
GDPR, it's medical ethics.
Sorry, but no, sorry. Yes, this is the thing, because information is not coming from the GPs, it's only the taxi drivers can do all of the information. So the only way of knowing the council is if the actually taxi drivers do that. There's no other way of doing it.
Can I suggest that we go back to the solicitors that have drafted this and the other two authorities and question that? Okay. Chris, have there some more proofreading points?
There was just a question, Chair, on the standards. You asked. I think they're covered in the disabled access. This report is 40 and 41. I believe it's those standards with the measurements for the access.
Specification point, but we'll check the proof to make sure it makes sense. I think you've highlighted that it refers to something that's not clear. We'll check that and clarify it.
Okay, Pete.
One of my questions was asked by Chris, which was good, about the suspension. One is about the operator and storage of vehicles, of where to place them, because we don't want operators to store vehicles on residential streets, blocking said streets and causing an issue. Another one is really, is there anything missing from this report when we look at the Department of Transport's recommendations? Has there been anything that's been dropped? And then another one is there stuff in here that's going beyond the Department of Transport's recommendations that can be fed back to them as a positive that we're doing? And then my final one is really, how much did it cost to put this report together?
It was commissioned a long time ago. I'm afraid I don't know how much they paid for it. I'm happy to ask them and get that figure.
Can you put it on?
Sorry, I have one other point I've gotten to that. Whilst this is all going to taxi drivers and private vehicle hire, there's no mention of Uber. So should there be some reflection on Uber in some, because they have a lot lower standards?
So Uber are not an operator in Wokingham. Uber, their model, they're licensed as a private hire operator, and they operate private hire vehicles. In terms of consulting them, we could consult them. They are obviously putting forward stronger, more robust safety standards. They've received quite a lot of attention with their model. It's a disruptive model because of technology. So it's disrupted to the market. So we could consult with them, but also with that they're not licensed with this council. You asked just the other questions. I didn't take down the notes of them, but I believe you asked me or you asked the officers whether or not we are meeting the 2020 standards, and then also whether or not we are introducing anything further. I believe the scope of the policy update is to specifically meet those standards, so yes. In terms of whether we go further, I think there are areas where we have gone further. I would have to go back and highlight those sections. Something that jumps out to me at this moment in time comes with the local area knowledge test at the 6-year interval and so on, which we've had feedback on so far. So I'll probably take that away and get my highlighter pen out and come back to you in terms of what is a bit further than those standards. It's an interesting question.
Abdul, quickly.
I think Pete has raised a very good question. I have several drivers saying Ubers are coming into our borough, picking up the customers and going out. Although they are not being license. So how can they do that? I mean, they're really frustrated about that. Is there anything we can do to give our drivers our business here in Wokingham rather than giving someone from different borough? And I have several drivers been coming up to me and saying that, how do they operate that? And they're suffering at the moment, as we all know. So if we can give the bread and butter what they deserve, rather than someone coming from elsewhere taking the business. And that's really, I would like you as officers to look into it more deeply, please. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Just to come back on that. I suppose there's it's an interesting view, one to discuss between yourselves and provide some more direction. In terms of the legalities of the Uber model, it is legal. It's been tested, I believe, at the High Court and so on. Effectively, they are a licensed operator and they'll have licensed drivers, and then they use a model where you can select and hire and pre-book. So whether they are working in our area or in any other area, the fact that the vehicle is licensed to wherever their operator base is and the operator is licensed, then it's not so much a legal issue in terms of where they're actually situated. There could be another alternative view where the angle of the question is about out of town operators and trade and business. There could be an alternative view to look to the likes of looks to the likes of Uber or other bigger operators, and effectively license them through the local authority themselves, thereby providing the drivers that are within the area access to an alternative provider if that's a successful service. But that's not necessarily a licensing function. It would probably sit more with a business growth type strategic perspective. For our side of things, we respond to applications that are submitted and take them through the licensing process. In terms of the model that Uber and other operators are working through, they can effectively trade. The only time they can't trade is if it's a Hackney carriage and the Hackney carriages are applying for hire or the Hackney carriages are on our taxi ranks. That's illegal. They can't trade in our local area in that way, but they could take a pre-booking. It's to do with the deregulation that came in 2015.
Just further, I've been told by drivers in Reading, they said there's somehow the Reading Borough Council has stopped them picking up. So they have some sort of radio system electronically. They cannot, if they get picked up, they can sort of ban them. They won't get the communication. So if someone call Uber, Reading Borough Council has restricted some sort of technology which they can't access to get this passenger on board. So if Reading can do it, maybe we can do it. If someone can look into that.
I'm not sure if that's an urban myth, but I'll check with Reading Council and see if they have any technology for blocking Uber. Certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got no more speakers unless Rachel wanted. Oh, sorry, Pete.
Yeah, I still had one question about the operators parking their cars.
Sorry, Councillor. The operator's application, they have to get planning authorisation, so it comes under the planning aspect to regulation rather than licensing at that point when they actually apply for their operator licence.
So I'll just come back on that. I do think there's a gap there, because I know there's a operator who's applied for a license in a building near where I work, and all the cars are parked on the area and they're actually blocking the highway, but because it's a private street, there's no impact on his application. So it feels like there's a gap. And I'd kind of like the policy to sort of cover that gap.
Pete, is that within the borough?
Yes.
So perhaps you could discuss that with Kieran offline and see what he thinks. I have no other speakers. Speak now or forever, or whatever they say. Okay. Go on, Sarah.
Sorry, just on Pete's point, I think rather than just look at that individual thing, there might be a wider thing, and I'm assuming we're going to get another draft of this back to us at some point, because we've obviously asked for quite a few changes, and it would be good to see what options are available for the point Pete raised, because this might not be an isolated incident. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we have had a fairly full discussion on this report, and we've been asked to note the revised policy and bring any comments back by the 31st of July. We've asked to determine that a final revised policy be brought to the executive to approve, or to the executive member to approve, and determine that the Director of Place and Growth should work in partnership with neighbouring licensing authorities to achieve a similar timeline to any public consultation and policy review in neighbouring boroughs to achieve consistency of practice between areas. Are you happy to vote on those as one, or do you want me to split them up?
Just a point of clarification. Will it come to the committee before it goes to the executive? Amendments.
I think it's the executive policy.
Yes, it's a little bit chicken and egg. The recommendation you're about to be asked to vote on effectively allows, if you vote in favour of it, allows officers to work in consultation with the executive member for environment and community safety to authorise a draft policy to go out for public consultation. So that could happen before the next licensing committee, which is in October, I believe. So if this committee would prefer to see the draft, which is going out for public consultation at its committee meeting, then that would be an amendment to that recommendation, that it effectively should not go out for public consultation before this committee has seen the draft to be consulted on.
Looking at the practicalities of that, it would mean we probably would need to fit in an additional meeting, so because we don't want to delay it. Would that be fair?
I'm just going to say that.
Sorry, can you press the time?
I understand the practical elements of it. Could this be perhaps circulated to all members so they get to see it and comment upon it before it goes out in the public domain?
As officers, we'd be perfectly happy to do that.
Can you press?
It's a matter for you to decide if that should be the way forward.
If we do that, we need to put a time scale on it so that we don't come back in dribs and drabs. Okay. Are you happy to vote on all of those as one? Can we have a show of hands then, please? Thank you, that's unanimous.
So can I just clarify, so you're saying you want this circulated beforehand via email before it goes to consultation with that amendment?
Yes.
Before it goes to the executive member.
Okay.
Before it goes for consultation. So committee members first, then the executive member, then public consultation.
Yeah, that's really useful.
Okay. And the last item on the agenda, item 9, taxi licensing fees and charges, page 117.
So a brought forward item from the last meeting, where a report was required of officers to cover the issues of the reduction in a licence fee for a taxi driver or a school transport vehicle driver in this financial year, 22-23. So that's recommendation 1, is to note that that has been applied, and the text of that is covered in paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 of the report on page 119 of your pack. That was voted through in the budget setting in March for the council's budget for 22-23. So the fee is now 248 instead of 290. Last year it was 290. The year before it was 248. So the decision of this committee was to reduce the fee in 22-23 to the same level as it was 2 years ago, in which year those drivers had benefited from a £40 reduction due to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So I've done it in reverse order. I'll just repeat it in chronological order. So 2 years ago, they got £40 reduction because of coronavirus. Last year, 21-22, the reduction disappeared. So it went back up to 290, including a £2 inflation uplift. So it's £42 increase to 290. This committee last July recommended that that should be reduced back to the figure the year before. But this committee cannot make a budgetary decision, so it would have had to have been an executive decision, and the decision was made for that not to happen. So paragraphs 4 onwards in the report describe that process, which I've just elucidated, and presents the options of whether and gives the committee the option to decide under recommendation 2 and actually I need to amend the recommendation to recommend to full council. It doesn't need to go to full council because there's still the opportunity to go to the executive to ask for a supplementary estimate for this year's budget to refund the drivers who paid for a licence last year at the higher figure back to the figure that they would have paid if it had been the year before. So in other words, a £42 refund for approximately 211 drivers who we have ascertained from our records paid for a licence in 21-22. So those numbers are on page 121 in your pack under financial implications. 211 licences comes out in the region of £8,500, which could be recommended to the executive through a supplementary estimate to provide the funds for that refund, given that this relates to last financial year, so it's not budgeted in this financial year. There is a paragraph there setting out the practical difficulties that might be encountered to make members aware that it probably won't be a simple, straightforward process of simply reversing a payment with a partial refund of £42. There probably will be some practical difficulties, and it may take us some time to do if members decide that we should do that. And in view of time and resources constraints, I think it's important that members know that, but ultimately it's a decision for you how that goes forward. The third recommendation is that this committee should decide whether it wishes to have a view on proposed fees and charges of all types of licensing for the future financial year before the fees and charges are set by full council. So that probably means coming to your October meeting with a set of proposed fees and charges for 23-24, which may include, for example, an inflation increase or of what magnitude that will be is impossible to say at the moment because of all the uncertainties about what inflation actually is at the moment, and how much of that could legitimately be passed on to taxi drivers who are feeling the effects of inflation, same as everybody else. But that will be a proposal that we can bring to October so that this committee has the opportunity to decide what fees and charge changes it wants to recommend in the fees and charges schedule.
Shahid and then Rachel.
I think from my perspective, it's a point of fairness. Some people were charged higher than they should have charged. Perhaps it's something we as a council got it wrong. Perhaps it went out, policy was implemented before I was officially sort of agreed. So I think morally and ethically, I feel that they should be paid, refunded. I obviously understand in the report says we have it budgeted for £8,500. In bigger scheme of things, £8,500 is not that great, but I mean, I think it's a point of principle. I think that's where I'm coming from. So I would strongly, I think it should go back to the executive and ask for that budget to be refunded. That's my personal view. But also in the future, there's a lesson for us in the future as well, that if we should look at the charges before and fully agree across all all stakeholders before it goes to the public, before it's implemented. So I think there's a lesson for us that we don't end up in the same situation. I do recognize that there will be some cost associated with the officer time as well to managing the refund. I don't know how much that could be, because obviously you're looking at 200 cases. But I just see that from a point of principle. They should have been charged the extra money they have. Therefore, we should refund it.
Rachel.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with Councillor Eunice on that. You know, a decision was made by, or a proposal rather, was made by this committee, and then it went nowhere. And it's only right that you know, that should be properly sort of enacted. I mean, if that's then overruled by the executive, then, you know, I would disagree with that, but at least it's transparent decision making. Whereas what has happened is that we agreed something and then nothing happened to it. So that needs to be put right. In terms of the administrative side, so I do think we should be refunding all of the 211 drivers, the amount that we previously proposed. I would personally be happy if, you know, in terms of the admin, could we credit the current drivers that are still active? Could we sort of credit their accounts with the £40 rather than actually paying a refund? And then the remaining drivers that are no longer active, that would reduce the pool of people that we actually have to make a manual refund to. I don't know if that helps or if that's not workable. And then in terms of the exec approval, I mean, as Shahid says, you know, £8,500 is tiny for the council's budget. You know, we were talking at council the other day about sort of £300,000 potentially being immaterial. So it is a fraction, but to those drivers, or some of those drivers, it's a material sum. So yeah, I do think I agree totally. We should be refunding the full amount, and we should propose that to the executive.
Sarah.
Yeah, I agree that we should be refunding that. I mean, obviously, the process of how we go about that needs to still be determined. I mean, Rachel's come up with a really great suggestion there. I guess the way forward with that would be that we wouldn't necessarily determine that, and you would brief the exec member on the paper that goes to executive on the options. But you know, a range of options that the exec member could then look at. But I think that's a good way of doing it and reducing those admin costs. I do want to come back to the whole debacle that has ended up in this situation, which quite frankly is really ridiculous. And I wanted to make a couple of suggestions. I note that we now obviously have someone from the legal team here, but we haven't always had a legal representative in these meetings, which if we had done might have helped. So I'm assuming going forward we'll always have someone from legal here, will we, Luciana?
It's something we can organise, yes.
Yeah, I think given that this is a licensing committee, it makes sense to have a legal representative. There's only 4 meetings a year, isn't there? So it would make sense. Secondly, the only reason why we picked up on this recommendation not having gone through is just because it was asked in matters arising out of minutes and no one actually bothered to tell us. One thing that we got put in on the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee is an action tracker, an item in the agenda that we have every time that looks at recommendations made by this committee and actions from it, with an update in there each time so we can see as a committee what's happening, because we shouldn't be having to every single time saying, has that happened, because then we found out, and that's not acceptable. So if we could have an action tracker item, I think in the agenda, so we can keep a check on these things, it would make a lot more sense. And we need to make sure, as Rachel said, that this goes through the proper democratic process. For it just to be pushed under the carpet in the way it was appalling. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you. As has been said, it was really a procedural error. Can't possibly be the case that this committee wants to have a 900, whatever it is, low charge in 2021, a low one for 22 to 23, but a high one in 21 to 22. It doesn't make any sense at all. So it's a mistake. We did try to rectify the mistake last June, but that's proved to be ultra vires. So I don't think we need to go to the executive. I think we can just refund the £42 to these drivers and then recoup the amount when we set the budget for 23-24, if that's legal.
Thank you. Pete.
One further suggestion: when we do go to the executive with recommendations and there is a difference of opinion with the committee, it would be useful to have some sort of report back as to why that decision has been made, because we could be unaware of things out of our remit. So it allows us to understand why a decision is being made.
Thank you. Abdul.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also in favour of refunding this £8,500 to those drivers. However, I think I had it said this committee doesn't have any budgetary power. So if this 8,500, how this money gonna come about? Our request, how is this request going to work? Is that going to be a special power to executive?
Effectively, the budgets for all departments, including licensing, are already set for this financial year. So to spend an additional 8,500, which isn't budgeted, we need the executive to, in effect, give us that money into the budget. So that hence the need for a supplementary ESTA report to the executive. It's further complicated by the fact that licensing fees are supposed to be based on cost recovery, and one type of licence income can't subsidise another one. And the proposal that we carry forward the refund to future year and recoup is not strictly legal, so it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. If we're going to do it, we need to do it in financial year with the extra funds made available into the budget to do it.
So if this is proof, hopefully it will, and when they will get the money back, roughly? It's good news.
I ideally wish it would be a straightforward process and they could get the refund as quickly as possible. We will do it as quickly as possible. I think we'll take the councillor's suggestions to use the most expedient method that we can devise. For some taxi drivers, that might mean that they refund accrues quite quickly. Perhaps they're in the process of applying for a licence at this moment. We can give them a credit towards it. Others may have stopped working in the trade, for example, and they may have moved address, so it may take longer to track them down. If they've changed their email address, got a new credit card, any number of reasons why it might be difficult. But you can have our assurance that we will not procrastinate on making the refund. We will carry it out in the most expedient matter that we can. I think the councillor is suggesting that we give an indication of what the method will be in the executive report is a good suggestion. We can do that.
Thank you. Can I ask, Ed, that you keep me advised of how that's going, so that if there are any really serious hiccups, the committee will know about it. Are you happy with that, members? Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to speak? Okay, can we look at the recommendation to note that the reduced fees have been applied in 22-23 to determine whether we apply the reduction and to determine whether we have a standard term of approval for fees and charges each year. Can we take those? Sorry, Sarah.
Well, we need to adjust them because we can't vote on them as is. So the first one, fine. With the second one, we need to determine that we will recommend to the executive member to apply the reduction. And so we need to change that one. We didn't really talk about having a standing item of approval of fees and charges in October, but I'm certainly happy to make that recommendation if someone wants to second that we do have that. I'd like to make a further recommendation that we have an action tracker standing item in this as well. Was there any other things that we asked for?
Legal rep
and a legal fifth recommendation that we have a legal representative at every licensing meeting. So because I think if that had happened initially, that might have helped. Thank you. Sorry, do I have a seconder?
Thank you. Okay. Are you happy to vote on that as the amended recommendation on block? Can I see a show of hands, please? Thank you, that's unanimous. That is the last item on our agenda. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy a nice drive home.
Chair.
Okay.